In October of 2012, Austrian skydiver Felix Baumgartner climbed into a pressurized capsule attached to a massive helium balloon and began ascending toward the edge of space. The world watched a man preparing to do something no human being had ever attempted at that scale. Step out from 39 kilometers above Earth and fall back through the atmosphere alone. Scientists had models. Engineers had calculations. Doctors had contingency plans for blood boiling, suit failure, loss of consciousness, uncontrolled spin, and death. But none of those documents could answer the only question that mattered. What happens to a human mind when it is finally alone with the thing it has rehearsed 1,000 times? Inside the capsule, as the Earth curved beneath him, Baumgartner was no longer protected by simulations, theories, or diagrams. Preparation had taken him to the door. Nothing more. Beyond that threshold, knowledge ended. There was only exposure. He later admitted that despite years of training, despite endless repetitions and protocols, his hands were trembling. His breathing changed. His body reacted as if all prior preparation had been erased by one brutal fact. Now it was real. This is where most people turn back. Not because they are incapable, not because they lack intelligence, but because reality feels fundamentally different from imagination. The body does not negotiate with your plans. It only responds to what is happening now. For years, people tell themselves they need one more book, one more strategy, one more month to feel ready. But readiness is often just a beautifully decorated waiting room. And eventually, everyone arrives at the same door. The question is never whether you understand what must be done. The question is whether you can step. Human beings have developed an extraordinary talent for hiding from discomfort while pretending to move toward growth. They call it preparation. A notebook filled with plans feels productive. A bookmarked course feels like progress. A carefully designed routine gives the illusion of movement. The brain rewards all of it generously. You feel responsible, disciplined, serious. But nothing essential has happened. No risk has been taken. No rejection has been faced. No uncertainty has been touched with bare hands. There is a quiet addiction hidden inside self-improvement. The addiction to postponing contact with reality. It is socially admired because it looks intelligent. Thinking appears noble. Research appears wise. Planning appears mature. But behind many forms of preparation is something far less flattering. Emotional avoidance disguised as discipline. You are not preparing to act. You are preparing to avoid feeling exposed. This is why some people can spend years studying communication while fearing one difficult conversation. They analyze entrepreneurship while never selling. They study fitness while avoiding the first humiliating week in the gym. They consume advice on confidence while structuring their entire life to avoid situations that require courage. Knowledge accumulates. Fear remains untouched. Because fear is not a logical problem. Fear is physical. It lives in pulse rate, muscle tension, stomach contractions, dry mouth, narrowed attention, catastrophic anticipation. It does not care how much you understand. It only cares whether you survived contact. This creates one of the most frustrating loops in human behavior. The more someone tries to eliminate discomfort before action, the more fragile they become when discomfort finally arrives. And discomfort always arrives, not as an exception, as the entry fee. There is a brutal truth most people spend years trying not to learn. The mind does not become calm because it understands danger intellectually. It becomes calm because it repeatedly discovers that uncertainty is survivable. This distinction changes everything. A person can memorize every principle of public speaking and still shake before speaking to 10 strangers. Another can read endlessly about relationships and still freeze before expressing genuine vulnerability. Someone can spend months designing the perfect plan and collapse emotionally the moment conditions become unpredictable. Not because they are weak, because their nervous system has not yet learned the lesson their intellect already claims to know. And the nervous system is stubborn. It believes experience more than thought. It trusts repetition more than intention. It updates only after friction. This means the life most people secretly want cannot be reached through emotional cleanliness. It requires contamination, contact, exposure to awkwardness, uncertainty, rejection, imperfection, confusion, and temporary incompetence. Not once, repeatedly. What you are about to discover is not comfortable knowledge. It is a confrontation with the machinery underneath your habits, your hesitation, your endless preparation rituals, and your dependence on feeling ready. Because perhaps the real obstacle in your life is not fear itself, but the hidden belief that fear should disappear before movement begins. That belief has quietly governed millions of decisions. It has stolen careers, relationships, opportunities, reinventions, conversations, and identities that never had a chance to be born. And almost no one notices it while it is happening. Imagine two versions of the same person. The first spends years trying to remove fear before acting. They seek clarity before commitment, confidence before exposure, certainty before risk. Their life appears rational, safe, thoughtful. The second acts while still carrying discomfort. They move with trembling hands, imperfect timing, incomplete knowledge, and visible uncertainty. Their early steps are clumsy, sometimes embarrassing, occasionally painful. From the outside, the first appears wiser. But over time, something strange happens. The cautious one remains psychologically fragile because their confidence depends on conditions being controlled. The exposed one changes, not because they became fearless, because fear lost its authority. One built a life organized around avoiding activation. The other trained adaptation. This is the paradox most people cannot tolerate. The path that feels safer in the short term often manufactures long-term weakness. And the path that feels threatening in the short term often produces long-term freedom. So here is the uncomfortable question hidden underneath almost every delayed dream, postponed conversation, abandoned ambition, and carefully justified hesitation. Are you actually preparing for your future? Or are you constructing a sophisticated system for never confronting the moment that would change you? Because there is a line almost nobody wants to cross. On one side, imagination, explanation, strategy, rehearsal. On the other, contact with reality. And once you understand what truly happens when a human being crosses that line, you can never again pretend that more preparation is the missing ingredient. So what is it exactly that changes inside a person the moment they stop preparing and start entering the fire? There is something psychologically seductive about feeling prepared. Not actually being prepared, feeling prepared. In 1975, psychologist Ellen Langer published a series of experiments that exposed a disturbing weakness in human judgment. People consistently confuse symbols of control with actual control. One of her most famous demonstrations involved something deceptively trivial, a lottery ticket. Participants in the study were divided into groups. Some were randomly assigned a lottery ticket. Others were allowed to choose their own number. Nothing else changed. The odds of winning remained mathematically identical. And yet something irrational happened. The people who selected their own ticket began behaving as if their chances had improved. When later offered money to exchange or sell their ticket, participants who had chosen their number demanded significantly more money to give it up than those who had simply received one at random. Same probability, different psychology. A meaningless act of choice created emotional attachment and inflated confidence. No additional skill had been gained. No strategic advantage had been introduced. No hidden variable had changed. But the mind interpreted selection as influence. This is the architecture of false readiness. The moment human beings are given a ritual that resembles agency, choosing, organizing, customizing, planning, they often experience a subtle neurological reward. Anxiety temporarily drops. Uncertainty feels reduced. Not because reality has changed, because perception has. This matters far beyond lottery tickets. The same mechanism quietly infects careers, relationships, finances, health, and ambition. A person writes the perfect business plan and feels closer to success. Another color codes a study calendar and mistakes structure for learning. Someone rehearses a difficult conversation 20 times and mistakes mental repetition for emotional preparedness. Control has been simulated, and the nervous system, easily fooled, relaxes. Langer's work did not stop with lottery tickets. Across multiple experiments, She repeatedly showed that humans become overconfident when they are given even superficial involvement in uncertain outcomes. In another variation, participants were placed in situations where random chance governed the result, but small cosmetic elements made the process feel personal. A choice here, a familiar pattern there, a decision with no objective power. The effect was remarkably consistent. People behaved as though uncertainty had become more manageable simply because they had interacted with the process. This is not rational behavior. It is emotional anesthesia. The mind is not always seeking truth. Often it is seeking relief. And the illusion of control provides exactly that. It softens the discomfort of unpredictability by creating the sensation that chaos has been partially domesticated. That sensation is addictive, because uncertainty is expensive to the nervous system. It consumes attention, elevates vigilance, increases mental fatigue, and activates threat detection systems. Human beings naturally search for anything that reduces this load. A checklist, a strategy, a routine, a ritual. None of these are inherently useless. The problem begins when symbolic preparation is mistaken for genuine adaptation. This is where many lives quietly stall. Someone spends months building the perfect morning routine while still avoiding the conversation that could alter their relationship. Another buys equipment, studies frameworks, researches markets, refines branding, and still never launches. Activity is happening. Transformation is not. The external behaviors look responsible enough to escape criticism. Even self-deception becomes elegant. But beneath all of it lies a simpler truth. You are not always trying to improve your future. Sometimes you are just negotiating with your own anxiety. This is what makes false readiness so dangerous. It feels almost identical to real progress. The emotional reward arrives before the evidence. That sequence is catastrophic. Because once the brain has been chemically rewarded for symbolic action, urgency decreases. Motivation softens. The illusion of movement replaces the discomfort that would have forced contact with reality. And the person often cannot detect what is happening. They sincerely believe they are advancing. This is why some forms of preparation become psychological sedation. A person spends hours reorganizing notes instead of testing their knowledge. Another researches productivity systems instead of doing difficult work. Someone redesigns goals, rewrites plans, optimizes environments, downloads new tools, and convinces themselves that refinement is momentum. It rarely feels like avoidance. It feels responsible. This is what makes it so effective. The mind has discovered a loophole. Obtain the emotional benefits of perceived progress without paying the biological cost of exposure. No embarrassment. No uncertainty. No possibility of failure. Just the warm sensation of control. But control purchased this cheaply has a hidden price. Because reality does not negotiate with internal narratives. Sooner or later, everyone collides with environments where preparation theater is exposed instantly. A difficult conversation does not care how many scripts you wrote. A real audience does not care how many books you read. A business launch does not care how perfect your spreadsheets were. At the moment of contact, only one thing matters. Has your system adapted to reality itself? Or only to the fantasy of being prepared? That distinction seems small while sitting safely behind plans. In real life, it changes everything. What Langer revealed was not merely a laboratory curiosity. She exposed a permanent vulnerability in human cognition. Give people a symbolic lever, and many will mistake contact for competence. A decision becomes mistaken for progress. Organization becomes mistaken for mastery. Preparation becomes mistaken for transformation. And because these substitutions are emotionally rewarding, they can persist for years without being challenged. This is why some individuals remain trapped in a strangely polished form of stagnation. Their life is full of systems, methods, frameworks, plans, templates, protocols, routines, and strategic language. Everything looks intentional. Nothing actually changes. There is something deeply uncomfortable in realizing that your rituals may not have been preparing you at all. They may have been protecting you from unpredictability, from humiliation, from feedback, from discovering whether your imagined identity can survive reality. This is where the illusion finally cracks. Not when you stop planning, but when you begin to ask a far more dangerous question. Which parts of my preparation are actually useful? And which parts are simply emotional armor? Because once a person sees this distinction clearly, many comforting habits begin to look less like discipline and more like avoidance with better branding. And that realization is only the beginning. What most people still do not understand is even more unsettling. Sometimes the harder you try to mentally control fear, the stronger that fear becomes. There is a peculiar arrogance hidden inside the human mind. It believes that if a thought is uncomfortable enough, it should be possible to remove it through force. Push it away, replace it, suppress it, outthink it. This instinct feels logical. It is also deeply self-defeating. In 1987, psychologist Daniel Wegner conducted a now-famous experiment that revealed a brutal paradox at the center of mental control. Participants were given an absurdly simple instruction. For the next several minutes, do not think about a white bear. Not occasionally. Not briefly. Do not think about a white bear at all. And if the thought appeared, participants were asked to ring a bell. The task seemed trivial, ridiculously easy. After all, how difficult could it be to avoid one specific image? But almost immediately, something destabilizing occurred. The more participants tried not to think about the white bear, the more frequently it invaded consciousness. The forbidden image became psychologically magnetic. The instruction itself had planted a trap. To successfully avoid the thought, the mind had to continuously monitor whether the thought was appearing. And in monitoring for it, the mind repeatedly reactivated it. Suppression created surveillance. Surveillance created recurrence. The attempt to eliminate the thought became the mechanism that sustained it. This is not just an experimental curiosity. It is a devastating insight into everyday human suffering. Many people spend years doing exactly this with fear. Do not think about failure. Do not think about embarrassment. Do not think about rejection. Do not think about uncertainty. And with every attempt at internal control, attention narrows around the very thing they are trying to escape. The mind becomes a prison guard obsessed with checking whether the prisoner is still inside the cell. Wegner later described this process through what became known as ironic process theory. The name sounds clinical. The mechanism is merciless. According to the theory, when a person tries to suppress a thought, two mental processes begin operating simultaneously. The first is intentional. A conscious operating process actively searches for alternative thoughts to distract attention. Think about something else. Focus somewhere safer. Replace the image. Redirect. But beneath this deliberate effort, a second process is activated automatically. A monitoring process scans consciousness for signs of failure. Is the unwanted thought back? Did it appear again? Are you thinking about it right now? This process is unconscious, persistent, and relentless. Its job is to detect the very thought you are trying to avoid. And in doing so, it keeps the thought neurologically available. This is where suppression collapses under its own design. The mind cannot stop checking for something without partially maintaining contact with it. The system meant to eliminate the thought secretly preserves it. This mechanism becomes even more destructive under stress. When a person is tired, anxious, overloaded, or emotionally activated, cognitive resources weaken. The conscious operating process becomes less effective, but the monitoring process continues, which means the brain becomes worse at distraction while remaining excellent at scanning for the threat. This is why intrusive fears often intensify precisely when people feel least capable of handling them. A mind under pressure does not become quieter. It becomes more recursive, more self-referential, more trapped inside its own alarm systems. And many people interpret this as personal failure. It is not failure. It is architecture. Once this pattern is recognized, entire sections of human behavior become easier to decode. A person terrified of public embarrassment constantly tells themselves not to blush, not to stumble, not to sound stupid. Their attention locks onto symptoms: heart rate, sweat, voice tension, facial heat, Every internal signal becomes evidence. Monitoring intensifies activation. Activation produces more symptoms. Symptoms trigger more monitoring. A closed circuit forms. The fear is no longer external. It has become self-generated. Another person tries desperately not to feel anxious before an important event. They check their emotional state every few minutes. Am I calm enough? Why am I still nervous? How do I stop this? The emotional inspection itself keeps anxiety alive. This is the hidden violence of excessive self-monitoring. Many people believe awareness automatically produces control. But certain forms of awareness are not observation. They are interrogation. And interrogation changes physiology. The more aggressively a person audits their own mind, the less spontaneous their experience becomes. Natural responses are interrupted. Emotions are pathologized. Mental energy is consumed by internal management. The result is a strange psychological exhaustion. Not from life itself, from fighting thoughts. This is why pure analysis is often an incomplete answer to fear. Thought alone can become a hall of mirrors, an endless conversation with yourself that only deepens self-consciousness. The person is not confronting the feared reality. They are trapped rehearsing it internally. And rehearsal without contact can become its own form of captivity. This is where many intelligent people become trapped for years, not because they lack insight, but because they trust thought as the primary instrument for solving emotional discomfort. If fear appears, they analyze it. If anxiety rises, they monitor it. If uncertainty expands, they think harder. More reflection, more internal dialogue, more management. And because thinking feels productive, they rarely question the strategy itself. But certain problems cannot be solved at the level where they are being maintained. The mind can become an expert at studying its own fear while remaining completely unchanged by that knowledge. This is the silent contradiction. A person may know exactly why they are anxious, exactly where their patterns came from, exactly which beliefs are irrational, and still remain just as reactive. Because awareness is not always intervention. Sometimes it is only observation with better vocabulary. Wegner's white bear exposed something psychologically humiliating. There are moments when direct mental control makes you less free, not more. The harder you grip, the more attention you donate. The more attention you donate, the more psychologically real the threat becomes. This is why many people are not simply afraid of an external event. They are afraid of what their own mind will do when confronted with it. And that is where the problem becomes far darker. Because what happens when fear is no longer just a thought to manage, but a physical system already wired to react before you can think at all. If fear can survive endless analysis, then something uncomfortable becomes impossible to ignore. The problem was never purely intellectual. It was physiological. By the 1950s, South African psychiatrist Joseph Wolpe had already begun dismantling one of psychology's most persistent illusions, that insight alone was enough to neutralize anxiety. At the time, many therapeutic approaches focused heavily on discussion, interpretation, recollection, and symbolic meaning. Patients talked, reflected, explained, revisited childhood experiences, analyzed emotional patterns. And yet many remained just as afraid. A person could explain their phobia with astonishing clarity while still being completely controlled by it. Wolpe became increasingly dissatisfied with this contradiction. During his early research, he studied anxiety responses not as abstract mental events, but as conditioned reactions embedded in the nervous system. Fear, in many cases, functioned like a learned association. A stimulus became paired with danger, and the body began responding automatically. Not rationally, automatically. This meant fear could persist even when conscious beliefs had changed. A person could know they were safe and still feel unsafe. This distinction was revolutionary, because if fear was partially conditioned, then perhaps it could also be reconditioned. Not through reassurance, not through argument, not through explanation, but through repeated physiological retraining. Wolpe began developing what would later become systematic desensitization, a method built on gradual exposure to feared stimuli while simultaneously inducing states incompatible with panic, such as muscular relaxation. The principle was deceptively simple. A person did not overcome fear by winning an argument against it. They weakened it by surviving contact with what had previously activated it. Not all at once, but progressively, the nervous system had to be taught a new reality. Walp's method was structured with unusual precision. Patients first learned deep muscular relaxation, often progressing through different muscle groups until their body could reliably enter a calmer physiological state. This was not cosmetic relaxation. It was strategic. Wolpe believed anxiety and deep relaxation were mutually incompatible responses. If a patient could remain physiologically calmer while approaching a feared stimulus, the fear response could gradually weaken through repeated pairing. Then came the hierarchy. Each patient constructed a graded list of feared situations, organized from least threatening to most overwhelming. A mildly uncomfortable image, a slightly closer interaction, a more direct confrontation. Step by step, they moved upward. This detail matters. The exposure was not random bravery, not emotional recklessness, not forced flooding into maximum terror. It was calibrated contact, measured friction, enough activation to trigger the fear structure, but not so much that the person became completely overwhelmed. This balance was critical. Too little contact and nothing changes. Too much and the nervous system only confirms catastrophe. Wolpe understood that transformation required an exposure dose the system could metabolize. This is why progress often looked deceptively modest from the outside. A person afraid of dogs might begin with imagining a dog, then viewing a photograph, then standing at a distance, then approaching incrementally, eventually touching the animal. What appears laughably small to an outsider may represent a biological revolution internally. Because the nervous system is not impressed by logic. It learns from repetition, proximity, and survival. A body that repeatedly discovers nothing catastrophic happened begins rewriting associations that discussion alone could never reach. This is where many people misunderstand courage. They imagine transformation as a dramatic moment, a breakthrough, a sudden conquest over fear, one decisive act. But Walp's work suggested something far less cinematic and far more useful. Fear is often dismantled through dosage, repeated contact in tolerable amounts, not heroic intensity, consistent proximity. The person afraid of flying does not become free because they finally think the correct thought. They become freer because their nervous system accumulates contradictory evidence. The feared outcome fails to occur, again, and again, and again. This repetition matters more than emotional certainty, because certainty is often unavailable at the beginning. Action cannot wait for perfect internal alignment. This is one of the most inconvenient truths about psychological adaptation. You may feel unready for most of the process. You may feel uncertain while healing. You may feel activated while changing. None of these sensations automatically indicate failure. They often indicate contact. And contact is where learning happens. Many people abandon progress because they misinterpret activation as proof they are getting worse. But activation is often the system becoming visible. You are finally seeing what was always there. Fear is no longer theoretical. It is being observed in motion. And once something is observable, it becomes trainable. This changes the relationship entirely. The goal is no longer to feel nothing. The goal is to remain present long enough for your body to learn something new. Walp's legacy was not merely a therapeutic technique. It was a direct challenge to a comforting fantasy many people desperately want to preserve. The fantasy that understanding should be enough. That if you study yourself deeply enough, explain your patterns clearly enough, and intellectually organize your fears with sufficient precision, your body will eventually cooperate. But biology is less obedient than that. It does not surrender to explanation alone. It demands evidence, repeatedly. This is why transformation can feel strangely insulting to the intellect. You may already know exactly what needs to happen, and still be required to do it anyway, not because knowledge is useless, but because knowledge and conditioning are not the same thing. One lives in language, the other lives in tissue, pulse, breathing, posture, reflex, anticipation. And these systems update on different schedules. A person can be mentally convinced and physiologically unconvinced at the same time. That contradiction explains far more suffering than most people realize. It also explains why so many remain stuck in loops of analysis, waiting for an internal green light that never arrives. They are waiting to feel transformed before engaging the very process that produces transformation. It is a circular prison, and breaking it often feels unnatural, because what begins changing a person is rarely what comforts them. It is what confronts them in manageable doses until reality becomes less threatening than imagination. But this still leaves one disturbing question unresolved. What if the body can learn safety from exposure, but the mind still refuses to believe what the body is teaching it? There is a limit to what the mind will accept as truth when the body has learned something different. You can repeat a rational sentence 1,000 times. You are safe. Nothing bad will happen. This situation is manageable. But if your nervous system has already encoded the opposite, those words often dissolve on contact. In 1986, psychologists Edna Foa and Michael Kozak proposed what became known as emotional processing theory, a framework that fundamentally changed how fear was understood and treated. Their argument was precise and deeply unsettling. Fear is not simply a fleeting emotional reaction. It is organized, structured, stored as an interconnected network of information in memory. This network includes representations of feared stimuli, expected danger, physiological responses, escape tendencies, and catastrophic meaning. A person afraid of public humiliation does not merely dislike attention. Their fear structure may contain an entire internal program.
Attention = danger.
Mistakes equal rejection. Rejection equals social death. Body activation equals loss of control. This structure can activate automatically, long before conscious reasoning has time to intervene. This is why many people feel irrationally overwhelmed by situations they intellectually know are safe. Their system is not consulting logic first. It is executing a preloaded threat script. Foa and Kozak argued that for fear to meaningfully change, this structure had to be activated and then modified through corrective information. Not bypassed, not avoided, activated. This means something profoundly inconvenient. If a person continuously avoids the feared situation, the original structure remains protected from contradiction. Untouched, untested, unchallenged. The system preserves its assumptions because nothing in reality has forced revision. And so the fear remains alive not because it is accurate, but because it has never been properly updated. This is where avoidance reveals its hidden cost. Most people interpret avoidance as relief, and in the short term it is. Avoid the conversation, and tension drops. Avoid the flight, and anxiety recedes. Avoid the confrontation, and the body relaxes. This immediate reduction feels like proof that avoidance was intelligent, protective, necessary. But from the perspective of learning, something catastrophic has happened. The nervous system has just been rewarded for escaping. It receives a powerful lesson. You survived because you left. The feared situation is never fully processed. No contradictory evidence enters the system. The original fear structure remains intact, often strengthened. This is the cruel elegance of avoidance. It works perfectly in the short term while quietly worsening the long-term problem. Foa and Kozak's model emphasized that emotional processing requires more than mere exposure to discomfort. The feared structure must be activated strongly enough to become accessible. The person must encounter the feared cues, experience the anticipated activation, and remain long enough for new information to become integrated. This new information is often painfully simple. Nothing catastrophic happened. Or, even more destabilizing, something uncomfortable happened, and I tolerated it. This matters because many fears are not built exclusively around external catastrophe. They are built around internal incapacity. The belief is not merely, something bad will happen. It is, I will not survive what I feel. Exposure directly attacks this belief. Not through persuasion, through evidence. A body that remains present through activation begins learning something words could never fully install. Distress is survivable, and that lesson changes everything. This explains a phenomenon many people find deeply confusing. Sometimes exposure feels worse before it feels better. A person enters a feared situation and experiences a surge of symptoms. Heart racing, sweaty palms,
Rapid breathing.
tunnel vision, urgent desire to escape, and they conclude they are failing. But from the perspective of emotional processing, activation is not necessarily evidence of damage. It is evidence that the target has been reached. The fear structure is online, visible, accessible. For years, many people have only interacted with their fears indirectly, through imagination, avoidance, rehearsal, distraction, or suppression. Now, for perhaps the first time, the system is being engaged where it actually lives. In real conditions, this can feel profoundly destabilizing. Not because the process is wrong, because it is finally real. This is one of the most misunderstood moments in change. People often abandon progress at the exact point where meaningful learning has become possible. They interpret discomfort as a signal to retreat, when in many cases it is simply the cost of updating old threat maps. Not all discomfort is damage. Sometimes discomfort is revision, a system reorganizing itself under new evidence. This requires patience the modern mind rarely tolerates. Immediate emotional comfort is seductive, but adaptation is slower, less dramatic, and biologically indifferent to your preferences. It asks for repetition, presence, contact, enough exposure for the old structure to lose authority over prediction. Not because you convinced yourself, because your body stopped believing the original lie. What FOA and Kozak clarified with unsettling precision is that fear is not dismantled by understanding alone. It is dismantled by violated expectation. Person expects catastrophe. The catastrophe does not fully occur, or occurs in reduced form, or occurs and proves survivable. Each of these outcomes injects instability into the original fear structure. Prediction begins to weaken. Certainty erodes. The system becomes less rigid. This is the beginning of freedom. Not because fear vanishes, because fear loses monopoly over interpretation. Something else becomes possible. Alternative meaning, alternative prediction, alternative response. This is psychologically radical. A person no longer experiences the feared situation as a closed script with a predetermined ending. Possibility returns. But there is a brutal implication hidden inside this model. No one can outsource this learning. No book can donate it. No explanation can install it. No one else can survive the experience for you. Corrective information must be earned through contact. Personally, directly, repeatedly. This is why so much secondhand knowledge feels strangely insufficient in moments of real challenge. Borrowed certainty collapses under pressure. The body only trusts what it has lived through, and that creates an uncomfortable confrontation for anyone still waiting to feel ready before engaging life. Because perhaps readiness was never supposed to arrive first. Perhaps readiness is nothing more than what remains after enough encounters with reality fail to destroy you. But what happens when experience itself begins changing not just what you fear, but who you believe yourself to be? Most people misunderstand confidence so completely that they spend years waiting for it to arrive before beginning anything difficult. They imagine confidence as a prerequisite, a mental condition, a feeling of certainty that should appear before meaningful action. Albert Bandura's work shattered this fantasy. In 1977, Bandura published research exploring self-efficacy, the belief in one's capacity to successfully execute behaviors required to manage specific situations. The distinction was crucial. Confidence was not treated as vague optimism or personality. It was situational belief built through evidence. In one of his most well-known lines of research, Bandura worked with individuals suffering from severe snake phobia. These were not mildly uncomfortable participants. Many experienced intense fear responses simply being near a snake. Elevated heart rate, visible distress, avoidance, immediate desire for distance. Their beliefs were not abstract. They were embodied conclusions, I cannot handle this. I am not capable of remaining in contact with what terrifies me. Bandura wanted to examine what actually changes this belief. Not what comforts people. Not what reassures them. What changes perceived capability. Participants were gradually exposed to feared snakes through structured therapeutic procedures. They observed models interacting safely with snakes, approached incrementally, and eventually engaged in direct contact themselves. This progression mattered, because something psychologically radical began to happen. Participants did not first develop confidence and then approach the snake. They approached the snake and then began developing confidence. This sequence is devastating to many comforting narratives. The emotional state people often wait for was not the starting condition. It was the consequence. Mastery did not emerge from anticipation. It emerged from evidence gathered in contact with reality. Bandura's model of self-efficacy was built on a psychologically brutal principle. People do not merely need positive thoughts. They need proof. Not abstract proof. Personal proof. Evidence interpreted by the nervous system as, I did this. I remained. I handled what I once believed would overwhelm me. This is what Bandura called mastery experiences, and he identified them as one of the most powerful sources of self-efficacy. The logic is almost embarrassingly simple. A person's belief in their own capability changes most reliably after successfully navigating challenge. Not before. After. This sounds obvious. Yet countless lives are organized around the opposite assumption. People wait to feel capable before beginning difficult conversations, ambitious projects, social risks, or personal reinvention. They seek an internal permission slip, a signal that says, now you are ready. Bandura's findings suggested that this waiting strategy is often psychologically backward. Capability beliefs are built by acting under imperfect conditions and surviving the consequences. This is what made the snake studies so revealing. A participant who once could not tolerate proximity gradually reached a point where they could touch, hold, and interact with the feared animal. Not because their fear magically disappeared, but because each successful encounter destabilized their previous self-concept. A new conclusion became available. Perhaps I am more capable than I predicted. That sentence changes behavior, not because it is motivational, because it is evidence-based. This is the difference between borrowed confidence and earned confidence. Borrowed confidence can collapse under pressure. Earned confidence has memory behind it. It is anchored to lived experience. And lived experience is much harder to argue against internally. This is why advice centered exclusively on believing in yourself often feels strangely hollow. Belief without evidence is fragile. It can sound convincing in moments of comfort and disappear completely under pressure. Bandura's work offered a far less romantic understanding of confidence. Confidence is not a mystical emotional gift distributed unevenly across personalities. It is often the accumulated residue of survived experiences. A history of confronting uncertainty and discovering that your predicted incapacity was exaggerated. This reframes many personal struggles. A person may not lack ambition. They may simply lack enough mastery experiences to justify trust in themselves. Another may not be inherently timid. They may have built an identity around avoidance strong enough that no contradictory evidence has been allowed to enter. This is where growth becomes psychologically offensive, because it removes a comforting excuse. You cannot endlessly wait for confidence while refusing the behaviors that generate it. The sequence does not work that way. Action comes first. Evidence follows. Belief updates afterward. This is emotionally inconvenient because it demands temporary humility. You must often begin while still feeling underqualified, uncertain, awkward, and unconvinced. Not as a sign you are doing something wrong, but as a normal phase of acquiring evidence. Many people never cross this threshold. They remain loyal to emotional readiness as a prerequisite and spend years circling their own potential. Not because they were incapable, because they misunderstood the order of operations. An order changes everything. Bandura's experiments left behind a deeply uncomfortable implication. Much of what people label as lack of confidence may simply be lack of evidence. not a character flaw, not destiny, not permanent deficiency, an information deficit inside self-perception. The person has insufficient lived data to justify trust in their own capacity. This should feel liberating. Instead, for many, it feels threatening, because it places responsibility back into direct contact with challenge. No amount of reflection can substitute for certain forms of experience. At some point, the question becomes brutally practical. What evidence have you actually given yourself? Not what do you hope is true, not what do you want to believe. What have you physically survived, navigated, tolerated, initiated, endured, repaired, or completed? These answers quietly construct identity. A person who repeatedly acts under discomfort begins accumulating an internal archive of capability. Not imagined capability, documented capability, and that archive changes how future uncertainty is interpreted. The unknown no longer appears as pure threat. It begins to resemble territory you may be able to navigate. This is how confidence is built. Not through prediction, through proof. But even proof does not solve everything, because there is another layer far more unsettling than capability itself. A person may know they can survive challenge, and still collapse the moment conditions become genuinely stressful, which raises a darker possibility. What if strength is not only built through challenge, but through controlled exposure to stress itself? There is an uncomfortable irony hidden inside modern life. The more aggressively a person organizes their environment around comfort, predictability, and reduced friction, the less prepared they often become for reality. Not because comfort is evil, but because adaptation follows exposure. Systems calibrate to the demands repeatedly placed upon them. Muscles weaken without resistance. Immune systems change in sterile environments. And under similar principles, psychological resilience appears deeply shaped by contact with manageable stress. This idea became central to Donald Meichenbaum's development of stress inoculation training during the 1970s and 1980s. The name itself was revealing. An inoculation introduces a controlled version of a threat so the organism can build stronger defenses before facing a larger challenge. Meichenbaum applied a similar principle psychologically. Instead of protecting people from all stress, his framework exposed individuals to manageable stressors while teaching coping skills, cognitive restructuring, and behavioral strategies. The objective was not emotional comfort. It was adaptation under pressure. This model was also reflected in military training environments, including forms of U.S. Army stress exposure protocols designed to improve performance under escalating challenge. Soldiers were not prepared for high-pressure conditions by preserving calm at all costs. They were progressively exposed to fatigue, uncertainty, time pressure, sensory overload, environmental difficulty, and simulated threat. Not randomly, systematically. The principle was brutally pragmatic. If future reality contains stress, then preparation cannot consist exclusively of stress avoidance. It must include controlled contact with pressure itself. This violates a deeply seductive instinct. Most people believe feeling less stress now will somehow prepare them for future stress later. But systems do not become stronger through theoretical readiness. They adapt through calibrated demand. Pressure in the right dosage becomes instruction. Stress inoculation training was not based on the fantasy of eliminating adversity. It was built on a more mature premise. Stress is inevitable. Therefore, the relevant question is not how to avoid all activation, but how to function competently while activated. This distinction changes everything. Meichenbaum's model typically involved 3 phases. First came conceptualization. Individuals learned to identify how they interpreted stress, what internal narratives amplified threat, and how their physiological responses interacted with cognition. Then came skill acquisition and rehearsal, breathing regulation, self-instruction, attention control, problem-solving strategies, cognitive reframing, not as abstract exercises, as tools. Then came application. This was the decisive phase. Skills were tested under progressively demanding conditions. Simulated stress, time pressure, social evaluation, environmental challenge, escalating difficulty. Why? because skills demonstrated only in calm conditions are psychologically unproven. A person may appear composed in theory and collapse under actual load. Performance under no pressure reveals very little. Pressure exposes structural truth. This is why controlled stress has developmental value. It reveals where systems fail while conditions remain survivable enough for learning. Mistakes become information. Overwhelm becomes measurable. Recovery becomes trainable. Without this exposure, people often build fragile identities around imagined competence. They believe they are prepared because their abilities have never been seriously tested. This illusion is comforting, until life performs the test without permission. And life is rarely interested in gradual onboarding. It introduces pressure with indifference.
No rehearsal.
No warning.
No negotiation.
This is where the comfort zone becomes more than a harmless preference. It becomes a training environment, just not for what people imagine. A life excessively optimized for comfort does not produce neutrality. Produces adaptation to low challenge. And adaptation is always specific. A nervous system repeatedly exposed only to predictability becomes calibrated to predictability. Minor disruptions begin feeling disproportionately threatening. Small inconveniences feel larger. Ambiguity feels intolerable. Discomfort feels abnormal. This is not weakness in some moral sense. It is conditioning. The organism has been trained on narrow conditions. Military and stress inoculation models understood this with unusual clarity. If future performance matters, training conditions must approximate relevant difficulty. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. You cannot meaningfully prepare for turbulence through permanent stillness. This principle extends far beyond military or clinical contexts. A difficult conversation, creative risk, leadership, public speaking, financial uncertainty, loss, conflict, all contain stress loads. Avoiding all smaller stressors in ordinary life does not preserve capacity for these moments. It often erodes it. This is why resilience can feel paradoxical. People often become more stable not by minimizing all discomfort, but by increasing their tolerance for it. Not recklessly, deliberately. A person who repeatedly enters manageable discomfort begins expanding what their system considers normal. Stress no longer automatically signals emergency. It becomes information, load, demand, something to navigate rather than escape. This is a different operating system entirely, and it changes how reality is metabolized. The brutal implication is difficult to avoid. Every day, whether consciously or not, people are training themselves. The question is not whether training is happening. It is what exactly is being rehearsed. Tolerance or avoidance, recovery or escape, capacity or fragility. A person repeatedly choosing only what feels manageable in the immediate moment may believe they are preserving peace. Sometimes they are quietly narrowing their operating range. The world does not necessarily become harsher. Their tolerance becomes smaller. This distinction matters, because many future crises are not catastrophic by objective standard. They become catastrophic relative to an undertrained system. Stress inoculation reverses this dynamic. It expands usable range through repeated, survivable challenge. Not by making life easier, by making the individual more adaptive. This is psychologically inconvenient because it means certain forms of comfort may come with hidden cost. Not visible immediately, but cumulative. A subtle erosion of tolerance. An untrained relationship with friction. A reduced capacity for uncertainty. And eventually, one disturbing realization emerges. The problem was not that life became impossibly demanding. It was that the system had become unfamiliar with pressure. But pressure is only one teacher. There is another force far more destabilizing than stress itself. Because when action begins stripping away comfort, something deeper is often exposed beneath the fear. Not what you are afraid of doing, but what you are afraid it might reveal about you. There is a hidden assumption most people carry without ever examining it. First, I become a certain kind of person. Then I act accordingly. First confidence, then boldness. First discipline, then consistent behavior. First identity, then action. Feels intuitive. It also appears to be psychologically incomplete. In 1959, Leon Festinger and James Carl Smith published one of the most influential experiments in social psychology, exploring what happens when behavior and internal belief come into conflict. Participants were asked to perform an intentionally dull and repetitive task: turning pegs, moving spools, repeating meaningless motions. The task was monotonous by design. Afterward, some participants were asked to tell the next participant that the task had actually been interesting and enjoyable. In other words, they were asked to behave inconsistently with their real experience, to say something they did not truly believe. Here is where the experiment became psychologically revealing. Some participants were paid $20 for this. Others were paid only $1. Later, participants were asked how enjoyable they actually found the task, and the results were counterintuitive. Those paid only $1 later reported enjoying the task more than those paid $20. Why? Because $20 provided sufficient external justification. I said this because I was paid well. No internal adjustment required. But $1 was psychologically insufficient. Too little justification for behaving inconsistently. This created dissonance, an uncomfortable tension between action and belief. And the mind sought resolution. If I did this for almost no reward, perhaps I actually believed what I said. Behavior had begun exerting pressure on identity itself. This experiment exposed something profoundly destabilizing. Humans are not merely creatures who act according to identity. They are also creatures who infer identity from behavior. Action is not just expression. It is evidence. And evidence shapes self-perception. This creates an unsettling loop. A person behaves in a particular way. The behavior demands interpretation. The mind asks, why did I do that? What does that mean about me? If the explanation cannot be comfortably outsourced to external causes, the interpretation often turns inward. Maybe I am this kind of person. This mechanism is not limited to laboratory deception. It quietly influences everyday identity formation. A person repeatedly initiates difficult conversations despite discomfort. Eventually, a new conclusion becomes available. Perhaps I am someone who confronts things. Another repeatedly avoids discomfort, delays decisions, withdraws from challenge. Over time, a different identity inference may emerge. Perhaps I am someone who cannot handle pressure. Notice the asymmetry. These identities may not have preceded behavior. They may have been constructed from it. Repeated action becomes autobiographical evidence. The mind is constantly building a narrative from what the body repeatedly does. Not what it intends. Not what it fantasizes. What it actually enacts. This is psychologically brutal because it means your behaviors are never neutral. Even small repeated actions are quietly voting. Not just on outcomes. On identity. Each repetition becomes informational material. Evidence submitted into the case file called self-concept. And self-concept is notoriously difficult to argue with once sufficiently documented. This helps explain why change often feels so psychologically violent. A new behavior is rarely just a new behavior. It is a challenge to an existing narrative. A person who has long behaved cautiously may not simply fear taking risk. They may be threatening a deeply reinforced identity. I am careful. I stay safe. I do not expose myself unnecessarily. Risk is not merely external uncertainty. It is internal contradiction. A behavior inconsistent with identity produces tension. And tension demands resolution. This is cognitive dissonance in ordinary life. A shy person speaks publicly. An avoidant person initiates conflict resolution. An undisciplined person follows through repeatedly. Each act introduces informational conflict. The previous identity model becomes harder to maintain. Not because someone delivered a motivational speech. Because behavior is becoming harder to explain using the old framework. Eventually the mind is pressured into updating. Not always consciously, but functionally. A different self-concept begins forming. This is one reason repeated action matters far more than occasional intensity. One isolated behavior can be dismissed as anomaly. Repeated behavior is harder to dismiss. Patterns demand explanation, and explanations become identity. This is why tiny repeated actions can have disproportionately large psychological effects. They are not small in narrative terms. They are repeated votes in the reconstruction of self. A person is, in part, becoming what their behaviors repeatedly suggest is true. The implication is almost offensive in its simplicity. You may not need to fully become a different person before acting differently. Acting differently may be part of how becoming happens. Not instantly, not magically, but incrementally, repeatedly. This does not mean behavior is always authentic from the beginning. Sometimes it feels artificial, forced, unnatural, a temporary contradiction between current self-concept and emerging evidence. Many abandon change precisely here. They misinterpret unfamiliarity as fraudulence. This is not who I am. But perhaps that sentence is less a revelation than a defense mechanism. A protest from an identity structure under revision. Because identities are conservative systems. They prefer continuity, predictability, narrative coherence, and new behavior threatens all three. Festinger and Carl Smith demonstrated that when action and belief diverge, something eventually gives way. Sometimes belief bends. Sometimes identity updates. Sometimes the story changes to preserve internal consistency. This means repeated action is not simply changing outcomes. It may be rewriting the narrator. And if that is true, then one disturbing possibility remains. What if the greatest resistance to exposure was never fear of failure itself, but fear that repeated action might force you to abandon the version of yourself you have spent years defending? There are moments in human life so extreme that they erase entire categories of illusion. Not gradually, instantly. On April 26, 2003, Aaron Ralston was descending alone through Blue John Canyon in Utah when a suspended boulder became dislodged and crushed his right forearm against the canyon wall. He was trapped, alone. No one knew exactly where he was. No immediate rescue was coming. The scale of the problem was absolute. A rock estimated at several hundred pounds pinned him with mechanical indifference.
No negociation. No clever reframing. No comforting abstraction.
Just reality in its most unedited form. Ralston spent approximately 5 days trapped in the canyon. He rationed food and water, recorded farewell messages, reflected on family, relationships, unfinished life, confronted the possibility of death not as concept, but as increasingly probable logistics. This is what extreme reality does. It strips away symbolic noise. Many anxieties that dominate ordinary life survive only inside relatively protected conditions. Status concerns, social hesitation, minor embarrassments, delayed decisions, manufactured urgency. But proximity to genuine survival threat reorganizes the hierarchy instantly. The mind becomes brutally efficient. What matters? What does not? What is real? What was performance? The canyon was not interested in identity narratives. Only constraint, time, biology, decision. This is psychologically revealing. When life becomes undeniable enough, much of what once felt overwhelming is exposed as context-dependent. Not imaginary, but inflated relative to true consequence. Reality at sufficient intensity recalibrates proportion. Time inside extreme confinement changes psychological structure. Hours behave differently. Thought becomes sharper, stranger, less decorative. The ordinary distractions of life disappear because they are no longer metabolically relevant. Ralston reportedly attempted numerous solutions. Manipulating the rock, using climbing equipment, preserving resources, assessing options with diminishing optimism. But eventually, the situation converged toward one unbearable conclusion. Survival would require an act almost impossible to imagine under normal conditions. He would need to amputate his own arm. This fact is difficult to psychologically process because it collides with ordinary thresholds of tolerability. What seems unthinkable in one context becomes negotiable in another when alternatives collapse. This is one of reality's harshest lessons. Human thresholds are often far more elastic than identity predicts. People routinely underestimate what they can endure because they are evaluating themselves under low-stakes imagination. Not necessity. Necessity reorganizes tolerance. It alters decision architecture. Under ordinary conditions, many people treat discomfort as evidence to stop. In survival conditions, discomfort loses veto power. Action becomes less about preference and more about consequence. Eventually, after exhausting alternatives, Ralston used a dull multi-tool to break the bones in his arm and amputate the trapped limb. Then he descended, hiked out of the canyon, and was later rescued. This event became globally known not merely because it was shocking, but because it exposed something deeply unsettling about human capacity. What you believe is intolerable may be far more negotiable than you think when reality removes the fantasy of avoidance. After surviving such an encounter, ordinary fear rarely returns unchanged. Not because life becomes easy, but because scale has been permanently altered. Ralston later described how the experience transformed his priorities and perception. This is predictable from a psychological standpoint. Extreme confrontation with reality often collapses trivial hierarchy structures. Many concerns are revealed to be inflated by abstraction, distance, and repetitive mental rehearsal. Reality at full intensity can be clarifying in almost violent ways. This does not mean trauma is desirable. It means direct contact with undeniable stakes often restructures what the nervous system treats as meaningful. The world becomes less symbolically crowded, more distilled, more honest. A person who has directly negotiated survival may not experience everyday inconvenience through the same interpretive lens. The previous calibration has been disrupted. This is the hidden power of radical contact. Not all exposure needs to be catastrophic, but all meaningful exposure introduces recalibration. Something once feared becomes familiar. Something once overwhelming becomes metabolized. Something once abstract becomes known. And what is known loses some of its imaginative inflation. This is true at every scale. A difficult conversation, public rejection, starting badly, being seen imperfectly, uncertainty, risk. Repeated contact makes the unfamiliar legible. Legibility reduces threat, not because reality changes, because your relationship to it changes. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable implication of all. Much of what humans call fear is amplified not only by danger, but by unfamiliarity. The unknown is fertile ground for distortion. Imagination fills absence with catastrophe. Distance inflates consequence. Avoidance preserves mystery, and mystery often feels larger than reality itself. Direct contact interrupts this loop. Not always pleasantly, not always gently, but decisively. Reality becomes less negotiable as fantasy and more tangible as experience. You stop relating to possibility as pure projection. It becomes terrain. Something navigable, something mapped through contact. This is why repeated exposure changes more than emotion. It changes ontology. What kind of world are you living in? A hostile world composed of looming abstractions? Or a world increasingly made of known variables, survivable friction, an imperfect but navigable challenge? The answer is shaped less by theory than by accumulated contact. Life remains uncertain. Risk remains real. Pain remains available. But unfamiliarity no longer monopolizes interpretation. And that alone can feel like psychological liberation. Still, one final contradiction remains impossible to ignore. Many people spend years protecting themselves from experiences they believe will break them, never realizing that the life built around avoidance may be the quieter form of breaking. There is a form of suffering people rarely recognize while it is happening. It does not look dramatic. It does not announce itself as tragedy. It often appears responsible, thoughtful, strategic, safe. It is the suffering of indefinite postponement. A life organized around preparation without collision. A person spends years refining systems, gathering information, optimizing timing, adjusting conditions. Not because these things are inherently wrong, but because each additional layer of preparation can quietly serve a second function. Delay. Delay feels rational. It protects identity from direct confrontation. As long as action remains pending, possibility remains intact. Failure has not occurred. Rejection has not happened. Incompetence has not been confirmed. The imagined future self remains salvageable. This is psychologically seductive. Potential is easier to love than evidence. Potential contains no bruises,
no humiliation,
no irreversible data, but potential also has a hidden cost. It produces a strange emotional purgatory. You are not where you want to be, but you can endlessly explain why movement has not yet begun. Tomorrow becomes a storage unit for unlived courage. Weeks accumulate, months accumulate, years become strangely aerodynamic. Nothing catastrophic happened, and yet something essential was continuously deferred. This is one of avoidance's greatest disguises. It rarely feels like surrender. It feels like one more reasonable delay, one more adjustment, one more period of readiness accumulation, until eventually a person realizes they were never waiting for the right moment. They were waiting for the disappearance of uncertainty. And that moment does not exist. Humans often imagine courage as an emotional event, a sudden arrival of certainty, a clean internal shift, a moment where hesitation dissolves and movement becomes natural. This fantasy is convenient. It relocates responsibility to emotion. I will act when I feel ready, when confidence arrives, when fear decreases. But this model quietly grants fear decision-making authority. Emotion becomes gatekeeper, and fear is structurally conservative. This function is not expansion. It is preservation, not accuracy, not growth, preservation. This means waiting for fear to approve movement creates a circular trap. You wait to act until fear reduces. Fear reduces primarily through repeated exposure. Exposure requires action. The loop closes. Nothing changes. Many lives become imprisoned inside this logic, not because the individual lacks intelligence, but because the operating rule is flawed from the beginning. Movement is incorrectly assigned as the consequence of emotional readiness instead of one of its causes. This reverses the actual sequence. Often, physiology learns after behavior. Confidence is frequently retrospective, not predictive. Person acts while uncertain, survives, acts again, survives again, and eventually the nervous system updates its assumptions. This is less cinematic than most people hope, far less emotionally satisfying, but also far more reliable. Courage is often not the feeling that precedes difficult action. It is the residue left behind after enough difficult actions survive contact with reality. There is another consequence of avoidance rarely discussed. Not all pain is immediate. Some pain compounds invisibly. Each avoided action seems individually insignificant. A conversation postponed. A risk declined. A challenge deferred. A beginning delayed. None feel fatal. And isolated they are not. But psychological life is cumulative. The nervous system records patterns, not isolated exceptions. Repeated avoidance teaches a lesson whether you intend it or not. This is dangerous. Stay away. You cannot handle this. Retreat preserved safety. The lesson is reinforced, then repeated, then reinforced again. Eventually, avoidance is no longer a strategy. It becomes architecture. A life begins organizing itself around minimizing friction. Routes are chosen accordingly. Relationships are shaped accordingly. Ambitions are reduced accordingly. Identity contracts around what feels safely manageable. From the outside, this can still look functional, stable, predictable, reasonable. But internally, a quiet erosion may already be underway. The world appears increasingly narrow. More things feel costly. Fewer risks seem tolerable. Freedom decreases without obvious imprisonment. No bars, no chance. Just progressive self-constriction disguised as intelligent caution. This is the paradox. Avoidance promises short-term relief while often manufacturing long-term fragility. protection, when overapplied, can become a form of slow deprivation. At some point, the negotiation has to end. Not because uncertainty disappears, not because conditions become ideal, not because the mind finally grants unanimous approval. Those terms are fictional. Reality does not reward internal consensus before participation. It simply continues moving, indifferent. Opportunities expire, bodies age, environments change, windows close without announcement. And still, many people continue arguing with existence as if more analysis will exempt them from contact. It will not. No amount of thinking can substitute for a nervous system educated by reality. There are things understanding alone cannot install. Only contact can teach them. Only friction can carve them. Only repetition can normalize them. Eventually, every person confronts a private threshold. A quiet moment where the real question becomes impossible to avoid. Not, what if this goes badly? But, what is the cost of remaining structurally unchanged? That question is harder, less dramatic, more honest, because life rarely collapses in one theatrical moment. More often, it is shaped by what was repeatedly postponed until postponement became identity. And beneath all the noise, one truth remains, sharp enough to silence everything else. The life you want is usually hidden behind a version of discomfort you keep refusing to meet.